supposed to be a secret.
Oh, I should take my stuff just. Just take this. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Все негазированную воду выпить.
Ну, вот давайте не говорим. Ой, я согласен, молодец. Я написал еще когда в первом веке.
Освоил.
У нас хорошо
Okay, dear colleagues, we are about 10 minutes past the time when we were supposed to begin. All right. Our next panel is called the Surrealism of Groups and Collective Traumas. And we have two presenters. We will begin with Alaina, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And the title of Alaina's presentation is Surrealism of Peoples, Juxtaposed Worlds and Imperial Exceptions.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. What I have to present right now is really a puzzle that is in progress. And so what I want to do is to show you a couple of the pieces that I'm working with. And I've got 3 of them. And the first 2 are schematic and very general. And the first has to do with the post-war moment, comparing the US and the Soviet Union. The second one is a bit earlier. I'm going to jump back in time and look at an aesthetic critique of imperial and modernist forms of vision. And then I want to come to my specific case, which is my ethnographic puzzle. And I'll tell you more about that as I get to the end. But since it's still a puzzle to me, I just want to foreground that what I'm trying to do, what I hope the discussion will help me do, is to figure out whether or not they really speak to each other or whether this is the projection of some kind. So this is an experiment in a way. So let me tell you the pieces then. The first piece, part 1 of this paper, has to do with how particular kinds of claims to exceptional qualities, such as, for instance, racial equality, how these kinds of claims to an exceptional state intersects with other kinds of exceptionalizing claims, such as, for instance, a claim to freedom of speech. So I'm interested in how they intersect in the Cold War period. And I'm going to make some really broad contrasts and comparisons between US case and Soviet case, because destabilizing those exceptionalisms, I think, will help me start to figure out how these pieces fit together. So you probably already are familiar with the modernizing visions of both the Soviet and American mainstream that both claim a sort of post-racist world in which everybody is equal, right? And you can find specific images of this kind of future imaginary, for example, both on board the USS Enterprise in the 60s in the US on Star Trek, and on the SS Tantra. You see these interstellar, international crews that depict this future of racial equality. So this new world that both US and USSR are competing to build, right, figures this something similar. There's some kind of intersecting, competing, mirroring dream that they're both building. And they're both competing to build sort of similar infrastructural models of development, and whether they actually do or not, right, becomes the question. But they're both promising irrigation, they're both promising roads, medicine, racial equality, right, to the former colonies after the war. And then meanwhile, in the metropoles, in Moscow, in Washington, those people are being courted, and now for their part, with visions of moving sidewalks, talking computers, space travel, right? So this imagined world of unity and coherence, as we all know, very quickly, you might say, in the big picture, within a few decades, is already breaking down everywhere. It's already breaking down by the 60s, the 70s. It's already being undermined by all manners of contingency and crises that are contradicting these modernist dreams. But somehow we've created a myth in the US that, well, let me back up a few steps. This contradiction unfolds differently in different places, and how people come to grips with these contradictions differently. But because of that, we've managed in the US to imagine Soviet spaces as somehow especially more both contradictory and somehow more censoring of the truth about those contradictions. And so I want to propose a few reasons how I think that US exceptionalism about having somehow access to the transparent truth and democracy and freedom might come about. So I have a couple of clunky materialist claims to make in contrast. So we have this idea that in the US we have freedom of speech starting since forever, right? But if you look further, right, but actually if you look at the 50s and the 60s, we were actually very good at evading looking at the contradictions to modernity. And we did so, though, by seeming not to impose censorship. And how did we pull that off? What was the magic that let us pull that off? So here's a couple of things I propose. First of all, we suffered almost no damage after World War II. We didn't have to devote resources to visibly fixing the infrastructures after the war. It's a huge contrast to the effects of World War II on Soviet territories. Few casualties. And number two, the material lack, the breakdown, the houses made out of cardboard and so on that we did have after the war, right? We're talking after the Depression. We were very successful in limiting much perception of that to racially separated spaces and networks. And this worked very well until about 1964. So denial of voting rights, access to literacy tools, and media enforced a hidden form of censorship such that the mainstream could pretend that modernity was working. And the people who had the knowledge and the information that it wasn't working, we didn't have to censor them because nobody was listening to them anyway, because those were the other people, right? So we didn't have to have censorship in order to not hear about how it wasn't working, right? So then the 60s, the social movements, things start breaking down at that point, right? Now, we're used to hearing in the US now I'm going to contrast to the Soviet case. Our imagination, our fantasy about the USSR is this land of exceptional and complete unfreedom and censorship, in contrast to the US. Now, both places, to be sure, are both places of knowledge limitation. I'm not saying that one, right, not that one actually is more free or not, but we have this imagination that we were. But I think the storyline shifts when we make specific contrasts and look at, for instance, World War II left stunning paths of devastation within Soviet territories, and with no deus ex machina of a Marshall Plan, the material affordances of decay are quite, and breakdown are visibly harder to deny in European and Soviet spaces. And moreover, race is structured differently in Soviet spaces. And I don't mean just the idea of race, but how it fits with structures of information, how it fits with structures of incarceration. In the US, statistically, most incarcerated peoples were peoples of color. And knowledge about mass incarcerations, right? So in Soviet spaces, knowledge of breakdown of incarceration couldn't be segregated. And so the dream of modernity comes to face the contradictions differently, right? And I'm not saying that people, for instance, such as gypsies, right, who I did fieldwork with before, I'm not saying they always had equal access to networks of power and that their knowledge wasn't different from that of white European and Russians in the city. It was, but still, knowledge wasn't cut by race law in the same way. And kinship really matters. Who can marry who matters. How people know each other matters. So when where America could pretend to exceptional freedom and movement of information up until, at least until the 60s, right? We could pretend that we had freedom of information, but we also had to make race, we can only do that while we were denying certain kinds of racial inequality that then had to be acknowledged. And then in the USSR could pretend to exceptional equality, but at the cost of making censorship visible. So it's a question really of how do you see and not see certain points? How do you both see and not see blockages to information, racial separations? And so this kind of argument I wanted to put out there because I'm going to try to come back at the end of the paper to talk about a similar kind of seeing and unseeing that might still be in operation today. Okay, so that's the first piece. And I'm going to make a little pause because otherwise it will seem really jarring when I move on to my next piece. Okay. Now, all right, and I wanted to stabilize World War II as some kind of founding moment, so I'm going to step back a few decades before the war, and I want to step outside the Cold War Soviet axis. And now I'm going to talk for a couple of pages about a movement of artists and poets who were claiming to set themselves against the sort of beginning modernist narratives of coherence and also against imperial kinds of vision. And they claimed that to critique the panopticism of imperial vision. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about surrealists, and not in depth, but just enough to remind you of what I think their project was and how that's interesting for us. Okay. So 1925 or so, the French surrealists declared their opposition to empire. They claimed alliance with anti-colonial political movements such as Negritude in the 30s, with Algeria in the 50s. They claimed to reject so-called Western aesthetics. For instance, stage director, playwright Antonin Artaud, if you remember, his theater of cruelty aimed to return theater to mystical, experiential roots that the West had poisoned. Surreal artists claimed to reject language and linear logic to reach the unconscious minds of viewers or spectators through a kind of ritualized associative symbolism, kind of something like an associative magic. So what kind of associative magic are we talking about here? So if you recall, most forms of modernism are playing around with associations and with ideas of structure and juxtaposition. So Meyerhold, Eisenstein, all of these high modernists they're all playing with juxtaposition. So what makes surrealism interesting here? Especially for what I want to say later about how we both learn to both see and not see something at the same time. Surrealism, if you remember, it works with a very specific kind of juxtaposition that plays not just with contrasts of scale or perspective alone, but that is trying to turn figure into ground and to melt inside with outside at the same time. So some people have called it a juxtaposition of two or more or less distant realities, but I think it's actually more to do with trying to put both figure and ground there at the same time, so that you're not just like this one in the center. Is it a head? Is it two women in a 16? I don't know what even year that would be, but non-uniform. Is it what is it? Is it this? Is it both? Right. So this aesthetic, these artists are claiming, is something that they are wedding with their political conviction that European colonial powers, with their linear forms of conquest and rule and vision, should be overturned. And how did that work? So I want to just show you a few images from World's Fairs to show you what I think their critique was, because when I look at it, it's hard for me to really see what is about this that could be a political claim. What is it about that form of vision that would put itself against in some kind of imperial universalizing vision? So you're probably all familiar with a lot of the scholarship on World's Fairs, on the diorama exhibits, on the kinds of juxtapositions of kinds of peoples, right, at the World's Fairs. And rather than review all of those with you, I wanted to just show you not pictures of the dioramas themselves, but pictures of people moving through World's Fairs, which I think are a big part of that phenomenon, is the sort of postcards showing other people going around at the World's Fairs. So let's see that one. So here's a picture of people, 1851 World's Fair, looking at the Canadian exhibit on their way to the next exhibit. So the idea here is to represent observers moving through expeditions, being able to take the meta position of juxtaposing one world to another and then inhabiting the position of a meta observer, right? It's a sort of fantasy of a panoptic world where I can see all the peoples around. Now, 100 years later, we see similar kinds of imagination being produced at the 1963 World Fair in New York. But here, the world that's imagined, it's not so much over there, but over there then, in the world to come. We're seeing juxtapositions of future worlds, this imaginary, linear. Now we're gonna, but we're watching the watchers watch. So right? There's this invitation to take up this meta-panoptic position, even as we're following this metaphoric line of imperial Cold War futuristic expansion. I'm melding these terms, Imperial Cold War, with irony, so don't call me on that later. Okay, so I'm thinking that perhaps Surrealism's revolutionary intent was precisely to comment upon these kinds of meta-framing, right, going back to the figure ground idea, to make us question, are you really seeing everything all at once, or do you just think you are? What is it that you're not seeing about something like race, or something like whether we have knowledge? Now, I'm aware, of course, that there are lots of criticisms of the Surrealists as Freudians who have, in fact, just projected this associationist magic into some kind of inner, authentic source of power inside the individual. I'm aware of that. And I'm aware that it could be the case that they're not really undermining panoptic fantasies, but they're just projecting a kind of a narcissistic vision of a dream self, an unconscious right? But that said, it seems like this is what they were trying to do. And so with that in mind, now I want to move to the third part, the third piece, and talk about a current moment within Russian television that seems to be playing with frames in a way that I can't decide whether it has something surreal about it. Is it critical? Or is it trying to create that kind of meta, juxtapositional, panoptic, skeptical viewer? And that's my puzzle, is I don't exactly know how to make it work, or whether or not it can be explained, or is it something ambivalent? Okay, another little pause.
Yeah.
Okay. So, part 3, now I would want to tell you about a trope of juxtaposition that is familiar within a television show that is familiar to a lot of people in the last few years in Russia. Does it qualify? Is it something that mirrors surreal discourse? Is it something imperial? I don't know. So I'm drawing my observations from a game show. Or a game reality show that I've talked about before. I know you've heard. I know, Victor, you heard me talk about it before, so I'll repeat a few paragraphs from that time. But there's a reality show that is called Battle of the Psychics. Bitva Extrasenses. Right. Yeah? Okay, Bitva Extrasenses. Yeah. And I think it echoes really particular threads of Cold War modernity and sort of dream of finding extra senses. And it also echoes threads of the sort of post-Cold War modern imaginary of having an array of the peoples, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, the premise of the show follows that of many reality game shows. You have contestants, they go through challenges, they're eliminated one by one. It's like Project Runway or these shows that set up different chefs against each other. In this case, you have people who are claiming to the status of psychic being asked, for instance, to wear a blindfold and read a newspaper, this kind of thing, all kinds of different tests. Now, it's worth mentioning, given our interest in problems of exceptionalism, that to be aware that the show was developed in Sweden. And it has Israeli, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Mongolian, and other versions ready. But it's also worth noting that the winners of the Mongolian version will sometimes come to compete in the Moscow version, so there do seem to be pipelines and competitions amongst the different versions. I haven't really conducted rigorous comparison across all variants of the show, but I can make a few remarks contrasting the Russian and the American version. The US version lasted half a season. The Russian version is in its 12th season. Now, the Americans will like to claim, and here's another sort of claim they like to make about Russians, they will claim that Russians are somehow particularly prone to mystic thought. And I don't think that's what's going on here at all. And the lie to that, I think, we can see, and here's why. If you look at the American version, for instance, the contestants are introduced each time with this kind of breathy expectation and a kind of mysterious music and so on. And winners and losers are announced, but nobody ever questions whether or not psychic powers are actually going on. The Russian version is all about testing. It's all about experimentation. It's all about setting up controls and having experts testify that the controls are followed, and then having a panel of experts discuss who actually stuck to the limits of the experiment. So, for instance, in one of the early episodes in season 1, the psychics are set to find a plastic explosive within a stadium. And so first they send out military dogs, and then they has a control and time that, and then they set out a platoon of soldiers and time how long it takes them. And then 3 brothers who are by profession magicians stand there and watch and make sure everything happens correctly, because since they're magicians, of course, their profession is to fool the public, so they will know if anybody's, trying to slip anything from up their sleeve or something. So they're watching to sniff out any tricks. That's what they're doing. So they trail behind each psychic, checking the procedures and adjusting boxes and so on. So you'll have one magician following the psychics, right? And here's where the idea of framing and watching the watchers comes in. So, and it's different, but it's similar. I'll come back to it. Let me explain it, and then I'll show you. So you've got, for instance, one magician following a psychic and it's making sure there's no monkey business going on. Then on a monitor screen, you watch his brothers watching him, and then they comment to each other about the proceedings. So for instance, they'll be saying, oh, look, that she's actually using her fingers to feel the rails, she's just using deduction, right? Or they'll watch and say, oh, he's trying to see her eyes for a reaction, he's just using psychology. So they're always commenting on who's not doing it right. So I'll come back to that. Now, one thing that's really important to mention here, and one thing that we could say is really obviously bringing all of this in line with sort of modernist claims of universalizing anti-racism or not, is a sort of manipulation and arrangement throughout all of the episodes of the national, the ethnic / racial identities of the contestants. So each show has carefully balanced the regional and national representation in a way that reflects the demographics of the former Soviet socialist republics. So all of the contestants who come to be tested will be identified as some kind. There's the Uzbek specialist, the Buryat shaman, the Russian hereditary witch, and so on and so on. So it's like they all have different masti. It's like the battle of the different kinds of psychics, it really turns out to be. So it's not just psychics, but from which place. Now, what's interesting about this, and we could easily draw parallels here with Friendship of the People's kinds of images, and with the World's Fair exhibits. And we could also, it could be very interesting to look at and follow the ways in which magic, across all of the empires that we've been talking about today, magic is projected onto others, onto other peoples. And it's really clearly happening here, right? But what I want to do is I'm going to tell you about that a little bit, but then I want to come back to the framing issue, because that's where I think what's really interesting is happening. Okay. But it is absolutely the case that the editors of the show make sure that no viewer can possibly miss these kinds of connections. So, for instance, if there is a person who's identified as gypsy undertaking one of these tests, they will play special music that's associated with gypsies. And the commentators watching on the other screen will, when she's doing her experiment, will make sure that they speak about it. So for instance, when one of the gypsy psychics was facing one of the tests, she asked to hold the hand of the magician who was cross-checking her, because the idea being that if she could hold his hand, that she could feel some kind of waves and emanations and be able to read more clearly what was happening. So as she asks to hold his hand, his brothers watching on closed circuit say, now she's going to take his ring. Or for instance, when the same psychic is given the opportunity, when she's faced the test of, the test was that the baby was laid in a crib and placed before 6 men, and the psychics were supposed to come out and say which one was the father. So she comes out and she looks at the baby, and then they cut to the mother in another room watching on closed-circuit TV, trembling in fear, and say, oh my God, the gypsy's going to look at my baby. So the editors make sure that there's no way that anyone will miss these kinds of connections that are being made. So this is very obvious, but I want to come back to the issue of framing, because while it's less obvious, I think it says something really interesting about the kinds of modes of extending and juxtaposing worlds that has a lot to do with the sort of problem of the surreal versus the imperial modes of dealing with juxtaposition. And this has to do with the ways that the editors, the film crew, and the set managers not only arrange frames within frames, but also try to highlight seeming breaks to the frame, or ruptures, and the way that they're trying to organize incoherence, right? And this is, I wanted to mention, there was a point made before about how it's not that incoherence has to do with some kind of radical critique, but is also somehow also, it can also be organized institutionally. So here you have a simple frame, a diorama-style frame, showing the psychic going through her test, trying to find something within a room. Then you have the layer where the judges are watching themselves talk about her, so frames within frames. You know, I'll come back to that. Yeah, you have time to read it. But these kinds of shots, these are not the only sorts of frame within frame shots. And one that I would like, I didn't manage to pull from the internet, but I can just tell you about, are the kinds of shots that producers use. They take care to reveal the kinds of ways they take care to reveal and disrupt these multiple nesting frames. So for instance, sometimes the producers will make sure that they include not just contestants' flights of temper when they declare that they're leaving the set, and then the camera follows them backstage, and then the camera shows other cameras watching those contestants, right? But also frames when, for instance, the camera is following the commentator down a road, and other cameras are also visible, and then the crew starts yelling at each other that traffic is coming and that they need to get out of the way, right? So there are all kinds of contingencies like these that are introduced. These ruptures that constantly remind the viewer not only that there is more than one frame to consider, but that they might want to start to consider or reconsider what actually is figure and what is ground. And so the show is oscillating on a couple levels at once between cultivating wonder about psychic phenomena and cultivating a skeptical position, so that the viewers can slip in between taking up that position with the magician of seeing who can see, right, and comparing and contrasting, but then also slipping into the sort of extreme realism where all the frames are disrupted. And so figure and ground are constantly being switched. And in terms of discourse, this is also happening because you've got the magician skeptics themselves. While they're setting themselves up as skeptics, they will also occasionally confess to feeling goosebumps of belief at certain demonstrations. So even those positions are always being disrupted. But then the next shot, you'll see a magician skeptic looking at his brother raising an eyebrow in doubt. Right? So you're always wondering, should I be doubting? Should I be invested? What kind of position to take? And so I'm finding this show really interesting ethnographically, not just in itself, which it is. And I've been interviewing former winners of the show. I've been talking to some of the skeptics, including this guy who was one of the MCs who claims that he was the guy who in the 60s was part of the Soviet military project to find the telepaths and the long-distance viewers who could see the American submarines, right? So he's the main skeptic on the show who is the expert of the experts who can then judge whether the magicians are doing a good job. So I've talked to him a couple of times. I'm going to go talk to the producer of the show next week. But what's really interesting to me is actually how people who watch the show get into fabulous arguments about whether or not to take up a position of skepticism towards what's happening and what that has to do with why all the Eastern people always win. So there's a way that they're pulling on these threads of remembering these Cold War fantasies of modernity and projections of superpower powers, and how that is also being contradicted. And so I wanted to just show you one of the extreme forms of skepticism that I found on the internet, somebody who was really completely dismissing the whole project of this show. But this is only translatable if you're already familiar with Soviet television, that serial shows that depict gypsies. Do you guys remember Возвращение Будулая, right? So here's the title of the TV show. This is the guy I was telling you about who claims to be the expert who was able to find a telepath who could see the guys who were making submarines. And he's there commenting on the other psychics, right? Here's an image. And someone has inserted the caption, Возвращение Будулая, which was the television show about the gypsy partisan during World War II, who after World War II goes to southern Russia and lives in a collective farm and learns to become a collective farmer. But then he discovers that one of the kids who has been adopted locally turns out to be his son. Right? And so somebody has written, the secret of who's the father of Tujiv's kid is going to be revealed. So they're mocking the sort of Soviet international project that lifts gypsies up into the partisan level and lifts them into the pantheon of friendship of the peoples. They're mocking the whole idea of finding out something secret, right? It's all folded within this position of extreme skepticism, right? But I want to just suggest that there are all kinds of other possible readings that people are working out and working through. And that sort of conflict is what really interests me. How is it that this talk about this television show and talk about things like extrasense itself reflects the ways people are still connecting to this post-war exceptionalizing project in Soviet terms, right? And how is that happening that something like friendship of the peoples and civil rights, these kinds of discourses, get connected in ever-changing ways with similarly exceptionalizing discourses about the competitive evolution of modern magics from telepathy and telegraphy and freedom of the press to something like telekinesis or space flight. So, 0. Time is up, and I'll go sit down and let the next person.
Our next presenter is Ilya Kukulin, who is Associate Professor of the National Research University School of Economics in Moscow. And the title of his presentation is Aesthetic Sublime. Popular and art house variants, and its forms in post-imperial culture and collective traumatic memory.
Please wait just 1 minute. First of all, I would like to excuse for my bad English. And then I try to present Dear colleagues, I would like to ask to excuse once more time. My presentation will differ from its proposal that presented in our workshop's abstracts. The material of contemporary art house literature in Russia. My first sample concerned one empire, but in other sense that Plastan writes. This sample is the Captive of the Caucasus, novella by Vladimir Makanin, Russian writer born in 1937. That novella has been written in 1994, half of a year before the beginning of the First Chechen War, which can be named post-colonial and neo-colonial in one time. One of its verbal leitmotifs are the words by Dostoevsky, "The beauty will save the world." But they are quoted with an estrangement. They are put in the invisible quotation marks. The main characters of the novel are soldiers and officers of the military unit quartered in a little base in Chechnya. Due to the bad military logistics, the officers change soldiers' weapon on the foot for those soldiers receiving it from the near Chechen village. A negotiator in this process is the Chechen hostage taken in village. However, when the officer calls him a captive, he laughs and says, "No, you all are captives here." The militaries from the base see the wonderful mountains, and Russian militaries is equalized in Makanin's novel with the soldiers of Urbachin's anxiety of the Chechen boys' beauty and sex appeal. The attitude of both types of beauty function as a natural, irrational, and estranged force experienced as the sublime. It seems to me that it is specifically post-imperial sublime. The sample of Makanin is interesting, however, its history, so to say, is not human, but textual. First of all, its characters has not social or psychological, but intertextual history. The Captive of Caucasus doesn't refer, for example, to the deportation of Chechens in 1944, or to the revival of Chechen nationalism in the period of perestroika. Makanin's novella refers to Russian literary works named The Prisoner of Caucasus, the long poem by Alexander Pushkin, and a story by Lev Tolstoy, or to other Caucasus texts of Russian literature, numerous, for instance, to the verses by Lermontov. However, the other type of specifically post-imperial works can be defined in contemporary Russian literature. They require the other methods of studying of the post-imperial sublime from the viewpoint of the traumatic historical memory about the distortion of the empires. It's necessary to mention 4 novels: the bestseller by Yuri Davidov, The Maidenhair by Mikhail Shishkin, and 2 works by Alexander Goldstein, Remember Famagusta and The Quiet Fields. Only Shishkin's novel is translated in English. All the novels deal with the fractured memory of different empires, superposed in contemporary world. The historical memory of their characters cannot be the memory of one isolated empire and its colonies. And all these novels are written with a more or less metrical prose, or the rhythm of a prose is accentuated, as in The Quiet Fields. The metrization of prose emerged independently. These writers belonged to the different literature generations and to diverse aesthetic movements. The plots of those novels are different, but all they refer to the author's 20th century Burtsov was known as the unmasker of the agent provocateurs of Russian secret police. He became a political emigre after Bolshevik revolution and fought against the German Nazis and anti-Semitism. He has been a witness on Bern trial in 1935 that sentence that Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a forgery. Burtsev recounted about Russian Department of Police as the initiator of Protocols creation. In 1938 in Paris, Burtsev published a book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a proven forgery. In 1942, he died in an occupied Paris. The bestseller mentioned in the title of that novel is The Protocols, glorified by Nazis and their successor and other anti-Semitic groups. The protocols are now remain, so to say, the bestseller of literature of such sort. In the widow's novel, episodes of Burtsev's life are situated between the events from the history of different empires. First of all, betrayals and provocations. The author appears in his work as a trickster, connecting the epochs and the kingdoms, but also as a young soldier. Just in the moment of Burtsev's death, young Yuri Davidov marches with some other recruits under a rain on the totally wet roadway to the front line of the World War II. Mikhail Shishkin's novel describes two lives: contemporary man named an interpreter living in Switzerland of 2000 and close to the biographical Shishkin, and well-known Russian female pop singer Isabella Yuryeva. The peak of her glory was in 1930s, 1940s. Many traumatic historical episodes are also connected in Shishkin's novel. The above-mentioned deportation of Chechens in 1944, or the difficult return of 10,000, a large army of Greek mercenaries hired by Kyros the Younger in 4th century BC. That adventure had been described in Xenophon's Anabasis, first autobiographical novel in the history of the European literature. The novel by Russian-speaking Israeli prose writer, journalist and culture theorist Alexander Goldstein, Remember from Augusta, 2005, named with a slogan by Cyprus Greek nationalists that emerged after Turkish seizure of the northern Cyprus in 1974. The town of Famagusta had been completely evacuated by its Greek Cypriot population. In the preface, Goldstein reconciled the slogan "Remember Famagusta" metaphorically as an appeal to remember discomfortable traumatic experience. The novel represents the episodes of author's childhood in Baku, the capital of Soviet Azerbaijan, which resembled a modernized Oriental colony of some European empire. The second character of the novel is Khachatur Abayan, the famous Armenian enlightener, prose writer and poet who lived in 19th century, joined German geographical expedition and climbed on the top of the Big Ararat mountain. Goldstein's novel brings together three types of historical sense and historical experience. First, the memory of Israeli inhabitant alarmed both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a bad attitude to Israel in Europe. Second, the memory of the inhabitant of many cultural Soviet Azerbaijan, repressed and modernized by the Soviet power. And third, the imperial sensibility of Khachatur Abayan. Structurally, the meeting of the interpreter and Yuryeva in Shishkin's novel is equivalent to the meeting of the autobiographical character and Khachatur Abayan in Goldstein's novel. The traumatic ruptures between different types of historical memory and different types of a narrative in these novels represent the juxtaposing of cultures and memories in post-imperial world. The metrization of prose was developed by these three authors in order to unite this patchworked world over the ruptures, which divide not the poor producers and rich consumers, or speaking more exactly, not only the poor producers and rich consumers, but the spheres of the historical experience. These ruptures and the clash of those different spheres of experience shape the feeling of the post-imperial sublime, very important for all three above-mentioned authors. The tradition of metrization in Russian prose was created by famous prose writer Andrei Belый in his works of the first decades of the 20th century. Belıy's writing may be interpreted, and it was interpreted by his it had been interpreted by his friend poet Vladislav Fedosevich as a writing of the individual psychological trauma. Belый tried to sew together the different social and cultural worlds of his mother and his father. The world of his father, famous mathematician, and his mother, who was close to artistic circles. But Belый himself considered his ruptured conscience and his perilous sensibility as the social and anthropological symptom, a sign of the future transformation of human nature and transformation of society. In the spirit of anthroposophy, he was successor of Rudolf Steiner. Now the post-imperial writers in their metrical prose shows the sewing, analogical sewing of ruptures of the historical experience, individual and collective, but in any case it's a historical more than psychological. Here it would be possible to use the concept of sublime historical experience developed by contemporary Netherlandian philosopher Franklin Rudolf Anker-Smit. He didn't write anything about empires or post-imperial states, but his analysis of the novel Hyperion by Johann Friedrich Hölderlin may be useful for the interpretation of the post-colonial imagination and post-imperial imagination. Anker-Smit shows that every historical experience based on the rupture between contemporaneity and a past, and that feeling of that rupture cannot be expressed and reflected with the words, fully expressed and fully reflected. We repel the past and keep it with us as the repelled one, writes Anker-Smit, who rejects the reduction of history to the narrative. Russian philosopher Petr Rezvych, discussing Anker-Smith's book, pointed out that Anker-Smit didn't mention Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, who associated the overcoming of traumatic rupture between past and present with experience of love. Rezvych reconsidered Schelling's concept of love in a more broader sense, as a common volition of the independent and principally different selves. The overcome of rupture with the traumatic past of a society, writes Rezvych, meaning post-totalitarian society. That overcome may be made only in the process of the communicative praxis. It seems to me that novels by Davidov, Shishkin and Goldstein are the models of post-imperial communicative praxis, which connects the voices originated from diverse epochs and cultures. The feeling of sublime, which is united in these novels with irony and self-irony by the narrators, shows us that the praxis will always knot together the historically separated voice, and thus it will never be finished. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. We have to keep you for the time. Didn't work very well. We have the floor open for questions, comments.
I have a few questions to both speakers, and both papers were very interesting. At least that they provoked a lot of ideas, and probably they were intended to. My first question is to Alaina, and I'm really very, very taken by your interpretation of surrealism as sort of an anti-imperialist project, and I was thinking about Russian and Soviet parallels to that, and surprisingly, maybe Ilya will correct me because he's a better expert in this author. It's not, in my view, the Imperio circle, which is Imperio, harms Sovediansky harms, compared with Dada. But and Surrealism, yes. But Yuri Alyasha with his novel Zavist, Envy, where the sort of universalized artist, which is partially surrealist, partially impressionist, just in his mind, of course, is directly confronting by his imaginary powers the modernity project embodied by his foe, Andrei Babich. Right, but looking back at the French surrealists, I'm puzzled by the fact that if you are right, and I think that you are right, how would you then explain, for instance, Breton's and Bataille's infatuation with the Soviet modernity? Well, where they were accepting completely uncritically and whatever they were finding in the Western modernity, they were completely overlooking when talking about the Soviet experience. Right, that's one question. Another question/comment is about this extra sense show, which you analyzed in a very interesting way, and really I didn't see this thing that you noticed, although I'm not an avid watcher of this. But I tried once. What do you think about, sort of considering your observations, what do you think about the following attempt to interpret this, that's sort of the vision of course, imaginary empire, minus rationalist modernity, or modernity's rationalism, plus racial slurs and sort of sort of empire of national magic, so sort of empire in its cynical version. That is post-colonial and neo-colonial at the same time, I wonder what is post-colonial about this text, because although of course it was written in 1994, and at that moment, sort of in the midst of the first Chechen war, it was perceived very much as the sort of anti-imperialist text. However, its entire metaphorical language is maybe serving as the best example for Said. It's the perfect example of Orientalism, sort of the Chechen boys effeminized, and it's inscribed into the beautiful landscape, and Rubachin is attracted to this effeminized savage, right, which is inseparable from the landscape. And even homoeroticism there is not exactly homoeroticism, it's basically the heteronormativity that is being presented as heteroerotic desire. So basically, Makhanin, completely unconsciously, of course, while trying to produce anti-imperialist text in my reading, is in fact reproducing the colonial narrative in its best, worst, if you wish, ways. And what Ilya mentioned, that the text there is rooted literally rather than historically, basically confirms this point of view, because of course both Pushkin's and Tolstoy's narratives are very, very typical for colonial discourse as well. Sorry for following questions.
I have a question to a comment to Alaina's paper, which I found absolutely fascinating. First a comment. It seems to me that in this show, the battle of psychics, yeah, which I haven't seen. But what you demonstrate very well how this Soviet concept of the friendship of the peoples is reinvented in a post-communist space, in post-communist Russia, where something which is very implicit but not spelled out in certainly in how this concept was originally formulated in the 1930s, is then made very explicit in post-communist Russia, not just in this show, but right across the kind of representations of ethnic relations. And what I mean here is that in this show and in general in the Russian media today, the idea about a causal connection between ethnicity, ethnocultural characteristics, and behavior is very, very openly spelled out. And you can detect the elements of that in the Soviet national project, but it's not at all as explicit as what we see today. And then I want to raise a sort of a couple of questions outside the seminar. You asked me to actually comment whether your attempt to compare such different things work, and I think it doesn't. Certainly with Surrealism, it's an excellent kind of framework to raise the question about criticism of imperialism, but also this very issue of seeing and not seeing. But then you have two kind of cases where you make a comparison, and in one case, I think the link is sort of kind of almost direct between this representation of ethnicity and behavior in today's Russia and this fairs or shows of the imperial period, where again the very idea that there is a direct connection between race and behavior was articulated. So, and you can almost draw a kind of sort of connection through sources, because today this kind of racial literature of the late 19th, early 20th century is published in Russia in enormous quantities. But then you have another type of comparison with this American show of the fair of the 1960s. And here I think it's a comparison by association. I don't think there's any kind of direct link. And I'm just wondering, we have in general, it's kind of a general problem for me that in particular historical research, one tries to find sort of causal connections and the links which you can follow through sources. And in literary scholarship, very often it's sort of comparisons by association. But because we have a sort of literary scholars dealing with issues of imperialism, colonialism, and they bring their methods to bear on actually historical questions, we often have sort of comparisons by association. Again, returning to Etkind, a lot of his work is comparison by association. And for a historian, it's quite difficult to take. And I was wondering whether you could sort of tell me that comparisons by association in dealing with, let's say, historical issues or nationalities relation could be valid. And then I wondered about why haven't you sort of mentioned at all and tried to compare this interest in extrasensory today and in early 20th century Europe.
That's,
yeah.
yes, that's a matter of...
Thank you.
Primarily for Alaina, though possibly it may invite a response from Ilya as well, if only because of the constant invocations of the Sublime in the phenomena I'm about to mention, which are phenomena about a further set of juxtapositions which may or may not be interesting to or even interesting for or even relevant to your questions. First, roughly the 2 decades between 120 and 100 years ago are in many eyes the high watermark of, some historians would say almost the only period of, truly mass enthusiasm for the imperial idea in the population of Britain itself. A high watermark also of representations of enthusiasm for an empire in a huge range of artistic and cultural genres. That same period is also a high watermark of fascination with the supernatural, of of spiritualism as a mass movement in Britain, of mystics and mediums. If there had been TV shows about it, there would have been TV shows in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain about this. The mass media of the day certainly did it. Now, and also simultaneously, it's generally regarded as a kind of the golden age, the classic era of the literature of the supernatural, the tale of the uncanny, the ghost story, etc. in English. Now, although in these latter, the spiritualist movements, the psychics, the supernatural literature of the period, there are a fair scattering of invocations of the colonial, the oriental, etc. I'm not sure what one could make of it, but there's an interesting juxtaposition. In your spirit, pause. Fast forward a generation or so. Not only, as you point out, do leading French surrealists themselves proclaim their anti-colonialism, though if I call rightly, didn't Breton later recant and get denounced as a traitor by all sorts of anti-colonialists. But the Caribbean, especially but not only the Francophone Caribbean, develops its own important semi-autonomous surrealist movement. And more or less simultaneously, you get in some of the earliest imaginative literature published in a number of Caribbean islands, a very strong streak of the supernatural tale, the duppy, the Orbiaman, etc., etc. What's often regarded as the very first Jamaican novel, H.G. Delissa's White Witch of Rose Hall, is in a sense a ghost story and a tale of witchcraft. Early Haitian literature at about the same time has lots of such invocations. So again, a juxtaposition of a particularly prominent role in literature, as in popular cultures of the Caribbean, for the supernatural, the psychic, etc., and the surrealist movement in the Caribbean. So I throw these in the spirit of your paper as further potentially pursuable and illuminating juxtapositions, though in the spirit of Vera's apt skepticism, I'm not sure what a historian could make of these.
Can I quickly, or should I?
Well, we have 3 more questions. Would you like to collect them first or respond? What's the preference?
My question actually connects with Vera's. So if somebody else before me take the question, but I mean, she might be able to answer both our questions.
Well, perhaps it's just 3 questions, so probably we'll just collect them and then
I'm getting a bit jet lagged, I have to say that, and therefore I might have missed some connection. So basically my questions are about clarification of certain points. So the first one is for Alaina. I like this idea of tracing the emergence and constant sort of reproduction of a particular structure with a framing that sort of you traced in all 3 examples, right? So like how the figure in the background emerged, and sort of like at the same time sort of there are constant productions of multiple subject positions through which you could choose which one you want to identify, and yet none of them use the normative, so that's quite interesting. What I'm missing is, okay, so you trace these 3 homological structures, and for me sort of the next step would be to explain sort of what is it that kind of underlines the similarity, right? So what is it that produces the same kind of sort of
Similar type of
exactly, yeah, the same kind of perception that, and you didn't quite link them all together. So I'm wondering, is it because of the time constraint or some other constraint, right? So it would be good if you could sort of comment on that. And for Ilya, you have like 2 really powerful analytical frameworks. One is sort of the trauma theory, right, to explain the sort of post-imperial narratives. And I really like your idea about rhythmic prose, and I think you could do actually a lot because sort of, I mean, there's a lot done on poetry, post-traumatic poetry, right? When sort of rhythm is a sort of a symptom of a particular traumatic experience. So I think it could be interesting. But what I'm completely puzzled by is the analytical usefulness of the Imperial Sublime. I just don't understand what it does for your explanation. So look, if you could expand it a bit, look how these two concepts, why do you need these two theoretical frameworks? What does the overlapping of them, of these two frameworks actually produce for you? What does it do for you? I just missed it, so look, if you could come.
I will answer.
Please, Dina.
I really like your, it brings a lot of ideas, and this way you frame the way certain claims of exceptionalism inform one another and also hide other problems in imperial, or contradictions in imperial and national spaces. But like Vera, I'm having trouble with the choices, and I'm not sure why surrealism, for example, as opposed to others. So I'm wondering, and this is a totally innocent question, because I'm interested in seeing in and if and how these sort of different ways of framing that you see are connected in some. Did these people read one another? Were they aware of what's going on? Did they willfully misapprehend certain things for certain reasons together? The other thing that I was thinking of is sort of your last project, which is this, game of psychics. And I'm wondering if we can sort of compare it within the United States. We're talking about a certain post-imperial moment in Russia, or is it a post-imperial moment? There are anxieties about lost empire and all of that. What you have in the United States are similar sort of in popular culture and public spaces. This is the age of ruptures. We have a president who justified part of his imperial project under Bush in terms of the structure from the Book of Revelation. This is his, I mean, you have to think of it this way. And I have to say, I'm addicted to this very popular TV show, Game of Thrones.
Oh yeah.
Which is wonderful. Which is wonderful, but zombies are back, and among the generation of my son, everybody's reading zombie stories.
Yes.
Why this coincidence in the interest of this sort of thing?
Actually, why this coincidence?
I had two little comments for Alaina. First of all, I was surprised that you didn't mention in your very interesting paper the common manifesto by Leo Trotsky and André Breton of 1938. It seems to me that the most political document signed by any surrealist.
Thank you.
The text named Literature and Revolution. Second, it seems to me that it would be interesting to search for some Soviet roots of Bitva Extrasensov in your interpretation, because it seems to me that it's important to mention that it was strongly different from the American experience. The literature, pop cultural artifacts, and so on about paranormal phenomena was forbidden in Soviet Union, and it was the phenomena of, so to say, underground mass culture. It was widely known and widely discussed, but it was forbidden fruit. And it seems to me that the popularity of such type of knowledge, of such type of discourse in post-Soviet popular culture may be connected with the Soviet restrictions of any New Age and paranormal discourses.
Thank you. Sonia had a good question as well, and then we have half an hour for discussion.
Yeah, I have a question following along these lines of the relationships between the three pieces that I think are very evocative and puzzling. the historical connections between the piece on the Cold War, certain kinds of Cold War paranoias and cultivations of skepticism, and the post-Soviet game show. And I mean, that was also more developed in the paper, so these tropes came up again in your interpretation of the game show. Whereas the bit about surrealism, for me it worked more actually, less as a kind of historical comparison, but more as like an analytical tool. Like as in Kukulin's paper, you would take something from somebody's interpretation of Hölderlin to look at like Russian language novels, not as a claim to historical connection, but just saying this is a useful tool. So that tool about certain ways of seeing, that's something you can use to analyze this game show. And then my question would be, so how far would you go with the application of that tool? Is it only useful to look at the specific game show, or is it something that you would use to look at more at wider phenomena?
And particular colonialism have been trying to think it through, but you could draw upon it in this case as well. So it's not a direct, this leads to that, and so therefore we have the extra senses. So that's really helpful. But I want to come back though to that question again from a different perspective in a minute. Can I go? Okay. So let me just go backwards then from this point. If I can go backwards through some of the questions. So, well, I didn't mention Trotsky in 1938 because I forgot about it, but that's actually, I haven't really, so maybe later we can figure out where that would fit. But about paranormal discourse and how they travel over time, and it's exactly, yes, this is what's interesting to me is how for centuries this talk about ghost stories and tapping and spiritualism and telepathy, these are all sort of being invented in parallel with imperial extension. And there are lots of scholars who've been writing about it. This guy, I can't remember the name right now, but there's a guy who wrote a great book about how telepathy is an invention of modernity. And it's in conversation with the invention of mass media and media that communicates without bodies present. So this whole problem of static interruption and freedom of the press is somehow, these are all somehow in occult discourse, back to even Blavatsky, back to Steiner and the Theosophy, and these are all somehow being brought together, and not just in Russia. So in Russia, before the revolution, there are people like Bekhtyarov, who is researching nerve psychology, that he's reading about radio transmission, doing experiments, and they're trying to ground this stuff to the body, and they're doing experiments, and then it's true that right after the 20s are over, that these kinds of discourses about whether or not the paranormal is real gets pushed underground, and people can't really talk about that in the same way. But I want to emphasize that lasts for a couple of decades, and by the end of the 50s, you're already seeing publications about Bechtyarov's experiments and Vasilev, and you already have people like Wolf Messing doing their stage shows. And so by the 60s, you actually do have a lot of publication and talk that's sort of in the semi-mainstream, and in films and so on. You start seeing depictions of this thing we call extrasense. So by the 70s, it's rife throughout, and it's in Anthropology, and it's already, people are talking about it. And so it's coming up in a way that I want to argue that is actually got some kind of genealogy that we can't just pin on post-socialist freedom of now we're free to talk about the paranormal. There's something it's connected in a more complicated way to how people are feeling themselves in a cosmopolitan conversation about what's happening. And some of it's spiritism, but some of it has to do with media and how do you think about the other and the paranoid problem, right? It's connected in a longer term kind of way. So that's, it feels as though to a lot of people, the perception is that we couldn't talk about this until 1991, right? And I think the show positions itself in that manner too.
Yes.
So I think, yes, there is that perception, the feeling that we couldn't, and I think that's important to deal with as well. So then, okay, so back to Gina's question about then how, so that actually, that's something that I started with is, why is it that in the US there is also a sort of fascination with the magic of other peoples and how do we access it through esoterica, and the sort of fascination with meditation and Buddhism and with developing psychic powers and all these shows and fantasies. So what is it about that is so appealing to people in these two different places? Is it the same really? And I think maybe Victor has more, I mean, you were telling us at lunch about this kind of visits that people make to these places where they can try to access both magic and like aliens from outer space, right? So I think there's something there's something similar about how that connects with the modern future dream that we've lost, but it's not really the same for the people that are, but it must have links back to this time when we're, anyway, so that this is still left to be fleshed out, and I don't really know why that coincidence, but I'm sensing it, and that's part of my puzzle, right? And I absolutely agree that I'm missing the links between, I can't claim I ran out of time. I'm just, I'm missing, and but I intuit these homologies, and I'm putting them out there, and I'm looking for, but I'm not really looking for the causation that one goes to another. I'm more interested in this kind of process of mirroring, and how do people hear a hint of a rumor that those people over there are doing it, so maybe we should do it too. So it's not even that, they maybe didn't even read exactly, you know, maybe I haven't read, maybe my family hasn't read Blavatsky, but some of it is, it's echoing out back and forth somehow. So when we do ethnography, we can't really, you know, we're talking to people that maybe don't read at all, or maybe they read a little bit, and there's bits and pieces, right? So it's harder to kind of create a genealogy. It's different from when you have a text and you can say, this person influenced that person. And, yeah, it's still possible, but it's yeah, so, okay, so, but that's why I think it would make sense to then think about these larger kinds of juxtapositions, and how it is that I mean, it's not a direct circulation, that they're anyway, so I don't know, Vera, if I answered your question yet, but okay, or I at least began to talk about it more later. So then the last thing I wanted to then bring it back to is a lot of people were asking me why Surrealism, and it doesn't quite really fit, why this, not something else. What do we do with the fact that the Surrealists themselves haven't acknowledged the kinds of holes in modernity in Soviet times, the Breton accepting them and then renouncing them later. And I'm thinking that it would be really interesting to sort of, I guess I can answer your evocation of that text with another text, and I'm thinking about, have you read Doris Lessing's book? It's called The Golden Notebook, and it's written, do you remember this?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, you're laughing, but I mean, it's sort of this account of disillusion with the gradually coming to terms with the knowledge that imperial racism in South America and what was happening in the Soviet Union are, I mean, that the disillusion is a sort of spreading of the disillusion amongst the communist European elite. But the book itself is trying to create a sort of thin frames kind of modernist form that by the end is in that same tradition, right? So I think somebody needs to do a history of what happened with that intelligentsia as they were trying to figure out the holes in the information, and that seems to be, I really don't know how to answer how it was that Breton at that moment. Yeah, I have to ponder that some more and think about that. But I was curious why you were laughing just now.
Well, I think because that particular book is such a kind of hold on the imaginations of almost a whole generation, or rather a particular cultural fraction of that generation and then beyond. And thinking both of various public conversations there have very recently been in Britain, I think it's for the 50th anniversary of the book, in fact, but also of a number of sort of private conversations that have involved me and all sorts of friends and acquaintances sitting around talking about how we are all the children or grandchildren of characters in the Golden Notebook.
But I mean, the problem of how do they come to see and then they can't see, and then that's the whole problem why she can't write. She can't put pen to paper because she can't come to terms with the fact that she's both seeing and not seeing that things are falling apart. And it seems like that maybe that's why surrealism and not one of the other modernisms that really claim that they break frames, but surrealism somehow bends them without moving to that estranging step in the same way. Maybe it's all passion.
Okay, thank you, Ilya.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to answer to Mark. Yes, the novel by Makanin, Captive of the Caucasus, it is produced from two components. First of all, the intertext of Russian literature, Pushkin and Tolstoy and so on, and maybe from the parodical comedy by Leonid Gaidai, The Female Prisoner of Caucasus, but it's less less important. But the second is the European eroticized Orientalism. No homoerotical motives are presented in Russian colonial or Oriental literature. And here we can say that European colonial imagination is represented in contemporary Russian situation in function of post-colonial and post-imperial. The main sign of this post-colonial and post-imperial function is the endless, unfinishing division of the selves of the characters. They receive the colonial experience which cannot be applied in the post-Soviet situation. According to Said, the typical character of the colonial prose England of France, which had received the homosexual and other unusual, unconventional erotical experience in the Oriental country, he became more European. He returned to Europe as the educated by Orient, or strived by Orient, but this this impression is the form of Bildung, of education of the right European citizen of empire. We have no similar in Makanin's novella. Then, I mean not Makanin's novella, but the Chechen War, post and neo-colonial in one time. I would like to answer to you. Just a moment. You asked about similarity or coincidence of the admiring of empire and admiring of supernatural. It seems to me that the concept of Sublime, which I try to discuss, presumes, so to say, only natural, supernatural, only natural, visible, or other acceptable by our feelings phenomena, which are can be reached in imperial situation. For example, exotic mountains, for example, strange feelings of travel, and so on. The feeling of supernatural, in your sense, they are generated by modernization. The evolution of empires and the modernization, they are connected, but they are two different processes. This connection with evolution of Russian society and modernization and admiring of supernatural, it is very well described in a recent book by Ilya from Philadelphia, Ghostly Paradoxes, about spiritual effects in spiritism in Russian literature. And then I would like to answer to Sergei. You asked me about usefulness of the concept of sublime.
Imperial.
Imperial sublime. In sublime in my sense. I would like to answer in sexually that it seems to me that it's useful because I try to analyze the literary works which are not connected with the traditional feelings of beauty and harmony, and they are based on the emotional and existential effects of the division of of self and being in the world which cannot be understood rationally and so on. Maybe these effects can be described or interpreted from the notion of uncanny, Imperial uncanny or Post-Imperial uncanny.
Why not use sort of a closer sort of concept? Say you could do a lot with melancholy, and that's what we are seeing again and again. And it is sort of connected exactly with the idea of trauma and sort of traumatic narrative and traumatic framework, and both with this experience of post-imperial kind of loss, right? I'm feeling the clash of two conceptual frameworks, and that's what sort of I guess I'm reacting to. So in the sublime, in the imperial sublime, because of Hasharan doesn't necessarily have to be used. Because he said so.
I started from the concept, from ideas by Ankersmith, who connected the idea of sublime with the idea of trauma, and it was a good starting point for my analysis. I don't think that the notion of melancholy can be applied here without any limitation, because without any limitations, because melancholy is some cannot assumes the construction of new self.
Christopher wrote a whole book on that. The Black Sun. It's exactly about that, like how sort of melancholy becomes a main kind of tool through which subjectivity is constructed.
yes, but it seems to me that the effects described by me, they are not only they cannot be interpreted only with the Christopher's books. I must think why it's so, but my feeling that Christopher's book is to describe to set phenomena, but my characters are not so set as in Christopher's book.
Okay.
Joyful, right? Well, we're, I think, at approximately the end of our timeline for today's meetings, and I'll ask very quickly if there are more comments or questions to presenters.
I just want to ask you about, was it the show on the TNT, that network?
TNT.
I just wondered if you could comment, because that network seems to be kind of have a particular niche in the Russian market.
I think maybe Vera can say more about that, because she's looking at it in the context of how television, the different channels are working with representation. She's been telling us about her research ongoing. So, but I get the sense that when you say TNT, people specifically, in fact, people have gone into arguments about the show where they say, the ones who are advocates will say, this shouldn't be on TNT, it should be on Pedagogical. You know, this is, so there's a hierarchy, but there's also sort of a niche feeling about this as kind of a trash network, and one that's more amenable to kinds of extremist, different kinds of discourses, but I'm not sure which ones. And I think Vera, Dom Dwara, so it's kind of the, yeah, it's like the, is it trashy network, right? Okay, it's trashy, but people, I mean, there are, but the kind of, that's not my criteria as an author for figuring things out, what's interesting, so, you know, I think that's important to
Yes. So actually, me too, I was going to ask you, I mean, why you took this case, I mean, Russian show.
Why this show?
Yes, and my question, let's say, I'm a sociologist, and my question is, do you know, I mean, how this Russian show was popular actually, in what kind of people, what kind of social groups actually watch it? And as far as I know, I wouldn't say that because you mentioned it regarding ethnicity, actually, I remember that one Kazakh lady, she won.
Yeah.
Here. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that, for example, if Uzbek, for example, or Kazakh participated in this show, that the whole country will watch this show actually. I wouldn't.
Sorry?
I mean, if, for example, some Kazakh or Uzbek, for example, we will participate in this show.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't suggest that the whole country, I mean, not whole country, that actually people from Uzbekistan will, I mean, sit to watch and will follow it.
I don't know anything about that. I'm not even claiming that everybody watches the show or that. But I know that within the Russophone parts of urban Russia, I find lots and lots of people that if they don't sit and watch a lot of it, they know about it and they are capable of arguing about it and having a position on it. So
my question was, my question was about, I mean, as far as if I understand you correctly, so Vera mentioned something how we can apply ethnicity concept to this case.
Well, here's sort of I wanted to be able to show this picture. Somehow didn't make it into my PowerPoint, but here's sort of a promo picture that's very careful to try to frame an array of friendship, of an example of each. So you can go through and go, here's one, here's one, here's another one, here's a gypsy, here's this one, here's that one. So, and every single episode, it seems, is careful to make sure that there is somebody from each kind. And I can just pass this down to you to see what it is. And so I've been trying to figure out how different viewers work with that, how the contestants play up to it. I met with one guy that won season 3, and he's from around Mehdi. Maybe you've heard of Mehdi. But he actually, after he had won the show, kept confronting all kinds of situations in which people would ask him to prove not only his sensory became very stressful for him. But this is, but I can't speak about it as a general phenomenon, but I'm trying to understand those kinds of moments when somebody like McGee gets interpolated into this kind of a show and how that plays out.
Okay, good. I mean, my idea was that it's like nothing to do with real ethnicity in these shows. Only my idea.
Oh, well, yeah, to be sure. It's
only
all about,
stereotypes.
exactly. It's all about playing with those and yeah, when you sit and talk to any of these people, there's so much else that they could have put into the show, but the editors, there are a lot of decisions that go into setting this up this way. And that's interesting.
Just a comment. My sense is that it is not that occult sciences were banned in the Soviet Union, but they were classified because they were restricted to military and secret services. That's the point. And many contemporary extrasensory, actors and magicians, they derive from military.
And they make that connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they'll say, look, I developed this in the lab.
That's the less known for the common audience, but that's important. And it's not only in the Soviet Union, the States.
Oh no, that's what the book alone trying to bring that. And that's part of the mirroring conversation. I think it's fascinating.
But if I may interfere, I'm sorry. I think that what Ilya meant, and Ilya will correct me if I'm misinterpreting him, that the connection of paranormal with the Cold War discourse is not typical for the late Soviet culture. It's not perceived as such. It's not inscribed into the Cold War discourse. That's the difference. No, it exists somewhere elsewhere. But there was no movies about the Soviet extrasense fighting James Bond. So that's a different kind of the cultural narrative, which didn't exist in Soviet. At least I don't remember any example.
At the point, it was restricted to a special sphere, which was
probably historically it was, but in the cultural imagination, it wasn't.
No, it plays out differently. I absolutely agree.
Not in general culture, no.
But the rumors were there, and they're becoming magnified. They're even the rumors about that period are magnified now.
In between?
Okay.
Just maybe this discussion maybe so to say mediated if we remember such other occult phenomena in late Soviet culture. First of all, the UFO.
Because my question was basically, what about science fiction?
Exactly. Yeah, look at that's the yes.
Because
you
there are several
layers.
layers.
You see it developing from before Frame. You see it in Bulgakov. You see it. I mean, it developed. I mean, this. People are reading it.
Yes, but in the Cold War, just a joke because we are all tired. In the Cold War, these UFO stories became, if you take another movie, Woody Allen, and Aniol is not about this, but it is the translation in the Cold War story, the translation of the UFO and so on into an administrative notion, because when Aniol says I'm from Philadelphia, I'm Catholic, and the other are alien, it's alien, and it shows that there, and this was precisely at the moment when in bureaucratic administration in the States, the foreigner and the strangers in which you never talk about this, use the term stranger, becomes an alien. And it's a new invention in the 70s when the stranger becomes an alien. And the paradox of all this is nowadays in the colonial studies of Russia, many Russians immigrants studying colonial studies, they translate inarodzi with alien. Yes, but it might be strange. I mean, you have to justify why a stranger is an alien. Not that
It's actually not American Russians.
but many others now are using, yes, but these are historical.
Since the 70s.
Yes, but the translation is taken for granted, while this term is an invention of the 70s, of the Cold War. It's the post-Cold War invention coming back to the Russian studies and say inarodzi are alien. Maybe are, but maybe are strangers. In Russian perspective of the 19th century.
1920s, immigration services?
Pardon?
It wasn't used in the 1920s by U.S. immigration services?
Alien?
Yeah.
Alien as a stranger, never. I mean, it's a real category when you fulfill into the passport the alien
Right,
and
right.
so on. Yes, of the
When
70s.
did it emerge?
In the 70s, before they spoke of strangers all the time, or foreigner. It was a foreigner.
Foreigner.
A foreigner. A foreigner, never an alien. The alien arrived much later. That's
There was a finance
The official
document
language is
with
much
the
earlier.
official category alien with extraordinary abilities.
Yeah.
The formal classification.
Let's thank the presenters and on this wonderful note, we are meeting in the lobby of the hotel.